So there I was, standing on what I thought was my own property, getting screamed at by a woman in a white SUV who was absolutely convinced I was some kind of vagrant squatter. She's already got her phone out, finger hovering over 911, telling me I have exactly 30 seconds to pack up my illegal campsite before she calls the authorities. Here's the thing though, I wasn't camping. I was setting up a tent on the lakefront of my brand new cabin. You know, the cabin I'd just spent my entire life savings on. The one with the deed sitting in my glove compartment. But Karen didn't care about details. She was too busy explaining to me how she's the HOA president and how people like me are exactly what's wrong with this neighborhood. People like me. Yeah, we'll come back to that. Let me back up and tell you how I got here, because this story is so much better when you understand just how peaceful my morning started. 3 months ago, I finally did it. After years of saving every penny, working double shifts at the hospital, and living off ramen noodles, I bought my dream property, a small cabin right on Lake Millfield, about 2 hours north of the city. It wasn't fancy, just a cozy 2-bedroom, with weathered cedar siding and a dock that had seen better days, but it had something I'd dreamed about since I was a kid, my own little slice of waterfront paradise. The realtor had been honest about the place. It needs work, she'd said, but the bones are good, and that view, you can't put a price on that. She was right. Every morning when I drove up there on weekends, I'd sit on that rickety dock with my coffee and watch the mist rise off the water, loons calling in the distance, pine trees so thick you couldn't see another soul, perfect silence. This particular Saturday, I'd decided to do something I'd been planning since I was 12 years old, camp out under the stars on my own land. I'd brought my old camping gear and planned to pitch my tent right on the grass between the cabin and the water dot, just me, nature, and the most expensive piece of real estate I'd ever own. I pulled into my gravel driveway around 10 in the morning, already feeling that familiar peace washing over me. The sun was dancing on the water, and I could hear absolutely nothing except birds and the gentle lap of tiny waves against my dock. I grabbed my tent from the back of my truck, found the perfect spot about 20 feet from the water's edge, and started laying everything out. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of gravel crunching under tires. Way too fast for a peaceful Saturday morning. I looked up to see a white Escalade barreling down what I thought was my driveway, kicking up dust like it was being chased by the police. The SUV screeched to a halt about 10 feet from where I was kneeling with my tent stakes, and out stepped Karen. Now, I know everyone throws that name around these days, but this woman was Karen with a capital K, blonde bob that looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, oversized sunglasses that probably had a designer logo I couldn't pronounce, and that walk, you know, the one where every step screams, "I demand to speak to your manager." She was wearing what I can only describe as aggressive athleisure. You know, the kind of outfit that costs $300 but is designed to look like she just casually threw it on to run errands. Everything matched. Everything looked freshly pressed. This woman had never broken a sweat in her life. "Excuse me," she called out, marching toward me like I'd personally insulted her entire bloodline. "Excuse me." I stood up, dusting off my knees, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. Maybe she was a neighbor coming to introduce herself. Maybe she'd seen me around and wanted to welcome me to the area. Yeah, I was that naive. "Can I help you?" I asked, giving her my friendliest smile. She stopped about 5 feet away from me, hands on her hips, looking at my tent supplies like I'd scattered garbage across a cemetery. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" The way she said it, like I was some kind of criminal caught red-handed, immediately put me on edge, but I figured there was just some misunderstanding. "I'm setting up a tent," I said, gesturing to the obvious pile of camping gear at my feet, "planning to camp out tonight." Her eyes went wide behind those ridiculous sunglasses. Camp out? Camp out? Do you have any idea where you are right now?" I looked around at my own property, cabin I'd been fixing up for months, the dock I'd repaired myself, the grass I'd been mowing every weekend. Yeah, I'm at my cabin." That's when Karen lost it. "Your cabin." She let out this laugh that sounded like a car alarm going off. "Your cabin. This is Governor's Point. You absolute." She caught herself, probably remembering she was supposed to be the picture of suburban respectability. "This is a private, gated community with a very strict HOA, and camping is absolutely prohibited. Period. End of discussion." I blinked at her. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my property. I bought it 3 months ago. Oh, really? She crossed her arms and tilted her head like she was talking to a particularly slow child. And I suppose you have proof of that. Actually, yeah, I do. I started walking toward my truck to get the deed from my glove compartment. Don't you dare walk away from me, she shrieked. I am the president of the Governor's Point Homeowners Association, and I'm telling you that this is private property, and you are trespassing. I stopped and turned around. Something about the way she said Governor's Point was bothering me. My realtor had definitely not mentioned anything about that name. Look, I said, trying to stay calm. I understand you're just looking out for the neighborhood, but this really is my cabin. Let me just grab my paperwork and we can clear this whole thing up. But Karen was already pulling out her phone. I'm calling the police, she announced, like she was declaring war. We have had enough of people like you thinking you can just set up camp wherever you want. People like me. There it was again. People like me. She looked me up and down, taking in my faded jeans, my old college t-shirt, my work boots that had seen better days. Transients, vagrants, people who think the rules don't apply to them. I felt my face get hot. All those years of working my ass off, saving every penny. And this woman was looking at me like I was some kind of homeless drifter who'd wandered onto her precious lakefront. Ma'am, I'm a registered nurse. I work at St. Mary's Hospital downtown. I bought this cabin fair and square, and I have every right to be here. She snorted. A nurse, please. Do you think I was born yesterday? She was already dialing. Yes, hello. I need to report a trespassing situation at Governor's Point. There's a vagrant who's set up an illegal campsite on private property and is refusing to leave. Vagrant, she actually called me a vagrant. I could hear the dispatcher asking questions, and Karen was getting more animated by the second. Yes, I've asked him to leave multiple times. No, he's being very aggressive and argumentative. I'm concerned for my safety. Aggressive. I hadn't raised my voice once. He claims he owns property here, which is obviously a lie because I know every single homeowner in this community. That's when something clicked in my brain. I pulled out my phone and opened up the photos I'd taken when I first bought the place. There it was, the little wooden sign at the end of my driveway that I'd never paid much attention to. Lakeview Estates, not Governor's Point. Ma'am, I said, holding up my phone. I think I know what the problem is. But Karen was too busy, giving the dispatcher a detailed description of me that made me sound like I was wanted in 3 states. Yes, he's got camping equipment everywhere. Looks like he's planning to be here for a while. About 6 feet tall, brown hair, wearing dirty clothes. Dirty clothes. I'd literally put on a clean shirt that morning. The officers are on their way, she announced, hanging up with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for people who'd just solved world hunger. I suggest you pack up your little campsite and move along before they get here. Or, I said, walking over to my truck, I could show you the deed to my property and we could figure out why you think this is Governor's Point when my paperwork clearly says Lakeview Estates. I grabbed the folder from my glove compartment, the one with all my closing documents, property survey, title insurance, the works. Karen watched me like I was pulling out a weapon. Here, I said, opening the folder and pulling out the official deed. See, this parcel number, this legal description, it all matches. I own this property. She snatched the papers out of my hands and squinted at them through her sunglasses. I watched her face change as she read. The smug confidence started to crack around the edges. This can't be right, she muttered. The survey's in there, too, I said. Shows the exact boundaries. You can see where my property line ends and where the road begins. She flipped through the pages, getting more flustered by the second. That's when I heard the sirens. 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up, in separate cars, and I have to admit, my heart started racing a little. I'd never been involved in anything like this before. The first officer who got out was probably in his 50s, with grey hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd dealt with situations like this before. "Good morning," he said, looking between Karen and me. "We got a call about a trespassing situation." Karen immediately launched into her story, waving her arms around and talking about vagrants and illegal camping, and how she was just trying to protect her community. The officer listened patiently, then turned to me. "And you are the property owner," I said, handing him my deed. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about which neighborhood this is." He looked at the paperwork, glanced at the address on my mailbox, then pulled out his phone and started typing. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "what's the address of the property you believe this gentleman is trespassing on?" Karen rattled off an address. That was definitely not my address. The officer nodded and showed her his phone screen. "According to the county assessor's office, that address is about a quarter mile up the road. This address belongs to ... double quotes. He checked my deed again. "This belongs to Mr. Johnson here." The second officer had been walking around the property, looking at the boundaries. Yet he called out, "The Governor's Point sign is up the road. This is definitely Lakeview Estates." I watched Karen's face go through about 17 different expressions in the span of 5 seconds. But that's impossible," she stammered. "I know every single property in my neighborhood. I've been the HOA president for 6 years." "Ma'am," the first officer said gently, "your neighborhood starts about a quarter mile north of here. This gentleman owns this property free and clear." The second officer walked back over to us. "Sir, just to confirm, you were planning to camp on your own property tonight?" "That's right," I said. "Just wanted to sleep under the stars for once." "Well, there's nothing illegal about that. It's your land." He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." While Karen fumbled around in her oversized purse, the first officer pulled me aside. "Between you and me," he said quietly, "we've had a few calls about this lady before. She's enthusiastic about property management. A few calls. Let's just say she has a very broad interpretation of what constitutes her jurisdiction." Karen had found her driver's license and was handing it over with shaking hands. The officer looked at it, then back at her. "Ma'am, your address is 1247 Lakeshore Drive. This property is 1156 Lakeview Road. You're not even on the same street." The next few minutes were absolutely fascinating to watch. Karen went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of Karen grief. First, denial. "There has to be some mistake. I drive past here every day." Then anger. "This is ridiculous. I know this neighborhood better than anyone." Bargaining. "Couldn't we just check with the county office? Maybe there's been some kind of error in the system." Depression. She actually started deflating like a balloon, her shoulders sagging as the reality of the situation sank in. And finally, acceptance. I may have made a mistake. This woman had called me a vagrant, threatened to have me arrested, and made me feel like a criminal on my own property, and she may have made a mistake. The officer handed her back her license. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious matter. In this case, it seems like it was an honest mistake. But I need you to understand that accusing someone of trespassing on their own property could have serious consequences." Karen nodded miserably. "I was just trying to protect the community," she mumbled. "I understand that," the officer said. "But next time, maybe check your facts before calling 911. After the deputies left, Karen and I stood there in awkward silence. For a moment, I was still pretty steamed about the whole thing. But looking at her standing there in her perfect outfit, looking completely defeated, I almost felt sorry for her. "Look," I said finally, "I get that you were trying to look out for your neighborhood. I respect that. But maybe next time, instead of immediately assuming the worst about someone, you could just ask." She nodded, not making eye contact. "And maybe don't call people vagrants when you don't know anything about them." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I jumped to conclusions. "Yeah, you did." She walked back toward her SUV, then stopped and turned around. "For what it's worth," she said, "your property is really beautiful." I looked around at my little slice of paradise, the cabin I'd worked so hard for, the dock I'd fixed with my own hands, the perfect camping spot where I was finally going to sleep under the stars. "Thanks," I said. "I think so too." That night, I set up my tent exactly where I'd planned to. I built a small campfire, cooked some hot dogs, and sat by the lake watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink. Around 9 o'clock, I was sitting by the fire when I heard footsteps on the gravel. I looked up to see Karen walking down my driveway, carrying a bottle of wine and looking incredibly sheepish. "I come in peace," she said, holding up the bottle, "and to apologize." Properly, we ended up talking for about an hour. Turns out, Karen wasn't actually evil, just overzealous and maybe a little bored. Her kids had moved out, her husband traveled for work, and being HOA president was basically her full-time job. She'd been dealing with some actual trespassing issues in her neighborhood, people parking RVs overnight, leaving trash, that kind. of thing, and she'd gotten a little trigger happy with the enforcement. I saw the camping gear, and I just assumed, she said. I didn't even look at which property you were on. I just saw someone I didn't recognize and went into protection mode. Protection mode. More like attack mode, if I'm being honest. We actually ended up laughing about the whole thing. She told me about some of the legitimate crazy stuff she'd dealt with as HOA president, and I told her about some of the characters I'd encountered working in the ER. Before she left, she gave me her phone number. If you ever have any problems with actual trespassers, she said, call me. I may have jumped the gun today, but I am pretty good at getting rid of people who actually don't belong here. I slept like a baby that night. The tent was perfectly positioned to catch the breeze off the lake, and I fell asleep to the sound of water lapping against my dock on my property that I owned. When I woke up the next morning, there was a basket of fresh muffins sitting on my picnic table with a note, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Sorry for the dramatic introduction. Karen, the crazy HOA lady from yesterday." I have to admit, they were pretty good muffins. The whole experience taught me something important about assumptions. Karen had taken one look at me and decided I was trouble. But I'd done the same thing to her, seen the SUV and the perfect outfit and the attitude, and decided she was just another entitled suburban Karen. The truth was, we were both just people, trying to protect something we cared about. She cared about her community, and I cared about my property. We just went about it in completely different ways. Although, let's be real, her way involved calling the police on an innocent person, and my way involved setting up a tent, so maybe not completely equivalent, but still, it worked out in the end. I still camp on my property regularly, and Karen and I have actually become pretty good neighbors. She keeps an eye on my place when I'm not there, and I help her deal with actual problem situations that require someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty. Just last month, she called me about some teenagers who were having parties on the beach behind Governor's Point. Instead of calling the police, she called me, and we went down there together to have a conversation with them. Turns out, all they needed was someone to treat them like human beings instead of criminals. We worked out a deal where they could use the beach on weekends, as long as they cleaned up after themselves and kept the noise down after 10. Problem solved. No police required. The funny thing is, if Karen had just driven up that first day and said, "Hi, I'm your neighbor, I don't think we've met," this whole story would have been completely different. Instead, she got out of her car ready for war, and I ended up with the most memorable camping trip of my life. And hey, I got some pretty good muffins out of the deal these days. Whenever I'm out at the cabin and I see Karen driving by, she waves and sometimes stops to chat. She's actually pretty interesting when she's not in full HOA enforcer mode. Last weekend, she brought her husband over to meet me. Nice guy. Turns out he's been dealing with Karen's enthusiastic community involvement for 20 years. She means well, he told me while Karen was inside using my bathroom. She just gets a little carried away sometimes. A little carried away. The woman called 911 because I was camping on my own property. But honestly, I kind of respect the passion. The world could use more people who actually give a damn about their communities. Even if they occasionally misidentify which community they're protecting. Just maybe check the address first next time. But wait, the story doesn't end there, because apparently Karen's reputation preceded her in ways I never could have imagined. About 2 weeks after our little camping incident, I was at the local hardware store picking up some supplies for my dock repairs. I was standing in the lumber section, trying to figure out which type of wood stain would work best for weathered cedar, when I heard someone behind me. "Excuse me, are you the guy who had the run-in with Karen from Governor's Point?" I turned around to see a man in his 60s, wearing paint-splattered overalls and a knowing grin. "Word travels fast around here," I said. "Oh, buddy, you have no idea. I'm Bill, by the way. I live about a mile down from you on the other side of the lake." He extended a weathered hand, and I shook it. "The whole thing's become legendary around here," he continued. "Karen calling the cops on the guy who was camping on his own property. People are still talking about it at the diner." Apparently, my story had become the stuff of local folklore. Bill told me that Karen had a reputation for being, shall we say, overly invested in property management throughout the entire lake community. She once called the county about my neighbor's dock being 6 inches too long. Bill chuckled. Turned out the dock was grandfathered in from 1987. and she'd been wrong about the regulations anyway. 6 inches. 6 inches. She had a measuring tape and everything. As we talked, more people started joining the conversation. A woman named Margaret, who owned a cottage on the North Shore. A young couple who'd just bought their first lake house. Even the hardware store owner came over to listen. Every single one of them had a Karen story. Margaret's was particularly good. Apparently, Karen had once marched onto her property and demanded she remove a bird feeder because it was attracting unsavory wildlife to the neighborhood. Unsavory wildlife, Margaret laughed. She meant cardinals and blue jays. The young couple, Mike and Sarah, told me about the time Karen had left a formal letter on their car windshield about their non-conforming canoe. Non-conforming, I asked. It was yellow, Sarah explained. Apparently, the Governor's Point HOA has very specific rules about what colors watercraft can be. But you don't even live in Governor's Point, Mike added. We're 3 neighborhoods over. The hardware store owner, whose name was Tom, had the best story of all. She came in here about 6 months ago, he said, demanding that I stop selling what she called aggressive lawn ornaments to people in the lake community. Aggressive lawn ornaments. Garden gnomes. She had a problem with garden gnomes. I was starting to understand that my encounter with Karen wasn't an isolated incident. This woman had apparently appointed herself the unofficial guardian of the entire lake area, regardless of actual property lines or HOA jurisdiction. The thing is, Margaret said, her heart's in the right place. She really does care about keeping the lake area nice. She's just ... intense about it. Intense is one word for it, Bill muttered. Tom leaned against the counter. You know what's funny? After your little camping incident, she actually came in here and apologized for some of the things she'd said to me about the garden gnomes. Really? Yeah. Said she'd been thinking about how she'd misjudged you, and it made her realize she might have been too quick to judge other situations too. That was interesting. Maybe our conversation by the campfire had actually made an impact. As I drove home that day, I started thinking about the whole situation differently. Here was a woman who clearly cared deeply about her community, but who had gotten so caught up in enforcing rules that she'd lost sight of the people behind them. I could relate to that more than I wanted to admit. Working in the ER, I'd seen plenty of healthcare workers who'd become so focused on protocols and procedures that they forgot they were dealing with scared, vulnerable human beings. I'd probably been guilty of it myself on particularly stressful days. Maybe Karen and I weren't so different after all. That thought was still bouncing around in my head when I pulled into my driveway and saw a familiar white Escalade parked next to my cabin. Karen was sitting on my dock, feet dangling in the water, looking completely different from the last time I'd seen her. No perfect outfit, no aggressive posture, just a woman in jeans and a t-shirt, staring out at the lake. Hey, I called out as I walked down toward the water. She turned around and waved. Hope you don't mind me being here. I was driving by and saw how peaceful it looked. My dock is your dock, I said, settling down next to her. Everything okay? She was quiet for a moment, watching a family of ducks paddle by in the distance. I've been thinking about what you said that night, she finally said, about asking. Instead of assuming yay, I realized I've been doing a lot of assuming lately, about a lot of people. She told me about her conversation with Tom at the hardware store, and how she'd started thinking about all the times she'd jumped to conclusions about her neighbor's intentions. The thing is, she said, I moved here after my divorce 5 years ago. I was angry and hurt, and I threw myself into being the perfect HOA president because it was something I could control. She paused, picking up a smooth stone from the dock and tossing it into the water. But somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats everywhere. Every new neighbor was a potential rule breaker. Every unfamiliar car was a trespasser. I turned into this person I don't even recognize. I understood that feeling. After my dad died, I'd thrown myself into work the same way, staying late every night, because home felt too empty and quiet. It's easier to focus on rules than feelings, I said. Exactly. Rules are clear. People are complicated. We sat there for a while, watching the sun start to set over the water. It was one of those perfect lake evenings where the air is still and the water looks like glass. Can I ask you something? Karen said eventually. Sure. When you first saw me that day, what did you think? I considered lying, but something about the moment felt too honest for that. I thought you were exactly the kind of person I'd been trying to get away from when I bought this place, I admitted. Entitled, judgmental, Someone who'd never had to work for anything. She nodded. Fair enough. And you were probably right about some of it, but I was wrong about the important stuff. You're not a bad person, Karen. You're just someone who cares a lot about something, and maybe got a little carried away with it. A little carried away, she laughed. I called the police on you for camping on your own property. Okay, a lot carried away. That got a real laugh out of her. You know what's funny? She said. After I left here that night, I went home and called my sister, told her the whole story. You know what she said? What? She said, Karen, you've become the villain in someone else's story. Is that really who you want to be? That hit me right in the chest. How many times had I been the villain in someone else's story without even realizing it? Your sister sounds smart. She is. She's also the one who suggested I come talk to you again. Said I owed you a real apology, not just some muffins and a note. Karen turned to face me, and I could see she was struggling with something. I'm sorry, she said finally. Not just for the misunderstanding about the property. I'm sorry for looking at you and deciding you were a problem before I even knew your name. I'm sorry for calling you a vagrant and making you feel unwelcome in your own home. And I'm sorry for being the kind of person who does that to people. It was a good apology. The kind that acknowledged not just the actions, but the thinking behind them. Thank you, I said. That means a lot. I want to do better, she said. I want to be the kind of neighbor I'd want to have. Over the next few weeks, Karen and I developed an unlikely friendship. She started stopping by on her evening walks, and we'd sit on the dock and talk about everything from local politics to our favorite books. I learned that she'd been a teacher before her divorce, and that she'd left the profession because she'd burned out on the constant testing and bureaucracy. She learned that I'd bought the cabin partly to have a place to decompress from the intensity of hospital work. We had more in common than either of us had expected. Karen also started making good on her promise to be a better neighbor. Instead of patrolling the lake area looking for violations, she started organizing community events, a monthly potluck dinner, a lake cleanup day, a neighborhood book club. The transformation was remarkable. People who'd been avoiding her for years started warming up to her again. The local hardware store owner invited her to join the Chamber of Commerce. Even the teenagers she'd hassled about their beach parties started waving when they saw her. It's amazing what happens when you approach people as allies instead of enemies. She told me one evening as we watched a group of kids fishing off the community dock. Yeah, but it's scary too, I said, because allies can disappoint you in ways enemies never can. She looked at me with a surprised expression. That's pretty wise for a guy who camps in his own backyard. Hey, camping builds character. Or maybe it just gives you time to think without distractions. She was right about that. Some of my best thinking happened when I was sitting by a campfire with nothing but the sound of water and wind to keep me company. The real test of our new friendship came about a month later when Karen called me in a panic. I need your help, she said without preamble. There's a situation at Governor's Point and I don't know what to do. I drove over to find Karen standing in her driveway with an elderly man I didn't recognize. He looked confused and a little scared. This is Mr. Henderson, Karen explained. He's been living in his RV in the parking lot of the boat launch for the past 3 days. My first instinct was to wonder why this was Karen's problem, but I kept that thought to myself. He's not causing any trouble, Karen continued. But the boat launch is technically Governor's Point property, and the HOA rules are pretty clear about overnight camping. I looked at Mr. Henderson, who was probably in his 70s and wearing clothes that had seen better days. What's your story, sir? I asked him. I'm just trying to get to my daughter's house in Michigan, he said quietly. My truck broke down and I don't have money for a hotel while I wait for parts. The old Karen would have called the police and had him towed. The new Karen had called me instead. How long do you think the repairs will take? I asked. Mechanic says maybe a week, if he can find the right parts. I looked at Karen, and I could see her wrestling with the situation. She had rules to enforce, but she also had a lonely old man who just needed a safe place to stay. What if he stayed in my driveway? I suggested. It's not HOA property, and he'd still be close to the boat launch for when his truck's ready. Karen's face lit up. Would you be okay with that, Mr. Henderson? I don't want to be a bother, he said. No bother at all. I've got electricity you can plug into, and a bathroom you can use. Mr. Henderson ended up staying for 10 days while his truck was being repaired. It was one of the best weeks I'd had at the cabin. Turns out, the man was a retired mechanic who'd spent 40 years fixing boats and RVs. He took one look at my dock and spent 3 days reinforcing it with techniques I'd never even heard of. "This'll last you another 20 years now," he said, admiring his handiwork. He also fixed my cabin's temperamental water heater, adjusted the door that had been sticking since I bought the place, and showed me how to properly maintain the septic system. "You've got a good setup here," he told me on his last night. "Reminds me of a place I used to camp when I was your age." Karen came by every day to check on him, bringing food and just sitting on the dock talking about his travels. She learned that he'd been living on the road since his wife died 2 years earlier, visiting their grown children and seeing the country they'd always planned to explore together. "I'm not homeless," he'd explained to her. "I just don't have a home anymore." The night before he left, Karen and I sat on the dock after Mr. Henderson had gone to bed in his RV. "A month ago, I would have had him towed," she said quietly. "I know. I would have seen the RV and the old clothes and decided he was a problem to be solved. But you didn't this time." "No. This time, I saw a person who needed help." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the gentle sound of water lapping against the dock. "He reminds me of my dad," she said finally. "After Mom died, Dad got really lost. He started taking these long drives, staying gone for days at a time. We thought he was losing his mind, but I think he was just trying to figure out how to exist without her." "What happened to him?" "He died about a year later. Heart attack. I always wondered if he was lonely, if there were people who looked at him and saw a problem instead of a person who was grieving. I understood then why this situation had hit her so hard." "Mr. Henderson's going to be okay," I said. "He's got family waiting for him." "I know, but there are probably a lot of people like him out there. People who just need someone to see them as human beings instead of problems to be solved." After Mr. Henderson left, Karen and I started talking about ways to help people in similar situations. She'd learned that there were actually quite a few travelers who passed through the lake area, and most of them were just looking for a safe place to rest. "What if we created some kind of informal network?" she suggested. "People who'd be willing to help out someone in need. Like a good neighbor program." "Exactly. Not anything official, just people who understand that sometimes folks need a little help." We started small, putting together a list of residents who'd be willing to offer assistance to travelers in need. Karen used her HOA president connections to spread the word, and I used my hospital network to find people who might be interested. Within a month, we had about 20 families who'd agreed to be part of what we called the Lake Community Good Neighbor Network. The first person we helped was a young woman whose car had broken down on her way to a job interview. She ended up staying in my driveway for 2 nights while a local mechanic got her car running again. The second was a family whose RV had developed a leak during a storm. They stayed with Margaret, the woman with the bird feeder, until they could get to a repair shop. Each situation was different, but the pattern was the same. People who just needed a little help, and neighbors who were willing to provide it. Karen had gone from being the neighborhood enforcer to being the neighborhood connector. Instead of looking for problems, she was looking for solutions. "This is so much better than writing violation notices," she told me after we'd helped connect a stranded motorcyclist with a local family who had a spare room. "More rewarding too, I bet. Way more rewarding. I actually look forward to my neighborhood walks now, instead of dreading what I might find." The whole experience taught me something important about assumptions and second chances. Karen and I had both looked at each other and made snap judgments based on appearances and circumstances. I'd seen an entitled suburban woman who thought she owned the world. She'd seen a vagrant who didn't belong in her neighborhood. We'd both been wrong about the important stuff, but more than that, we'd both been willing to reconsider our assumptions when presented with new information. That's not always easy to do, especially when your first impression is strong. I think about that a lot when I'm at work now. When I see someone in the ER who's angry or difficult or demanding, I try to remember that there's usually a story behind the behavior. Maybe they're scared, maybe they're in pain, maybe they're just having the worst day of their life. It doesn't excuse bad behavior, but understanding it makes it easier to respond with compassion instead of judgment. Karen and I still laugh about our first meeting. She's got the story down to a perfect 5-minute routine that she tells at neighborhood gatherings. "So there I was," she say, "standing in this man's driveway, calling the police because he was camping on his own property. The poor guy's got his deed in his hand, trying to show me I'm wrong, and I'm too busy being right to listen. People always laugh at that part, but then she gets serious. The thing is, we all do this. We all make assumptions about people based on what we see on the surface. The difference is whether we're willing to admit when we're wrong and do better next time. These days, I camp on my property regularly, and Karen often joins me. We'll sit by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, watching the stars reflect on the lake. Sometimes other neighbors join us. Bill from down the road, Margaret with her stories about the unsavory wildlife, Mike and Sarah with their non-conforming yellow canoe. We've become a real community, the kind I never expected to find when I bought my little cabin on the lake. Last weekend, Karen brought her sister to visit, the one who'd told her she was becoming the villain in other people's stories. "So you're the famous tent camper," her sister said when Karen introduced us. "That's me, the vagrant who turned out to own property." Karen's told me about everything that's happened since then. The Good Neighbor Network, the community events, all of it. She looked at Karen with obvious pride. "I have to say, I'm impressed. You've really turned things around." "We both did," Karen said, looking at me. "Sometimes it takes a complete stranger to help you see yourself clearly. Sometimes it takes a complete stranger to help you see everyone else clearly too." I added. "So that's my story about the time I got accused of being a vagrant for camping on my own land, and how that led to one of the most unexpected friendships of my life. If you've ever had your own run-in with an overzealous HOA president, a neighborhood Karen, or just someone who made assumptions about you based on appearances, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your stories. And if you've ever been the person making assumptions about others, share that too. We've all been there, and there's no shame in admitting it. The important thing is being willing to look beyond the surface and see the real person underneath. If you enjoyed this tale of mistaken identity, suburban drama, and unexpected friendship, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the weird, wonderful, and occasionally ridiculous experiences of homeownership and community building. Because trust me, buying a cabin on a lake comes with way more drama than the real estate agent mentioned in the brochure. But sometimes, that drama leads to the best parts of the story.